in the business at the time Dave Meltzer started his newsletter, did you ever think at any time he went too far and reported too much about the inner workings of the business? I've never understood why Dave wanted to expose the sport, built on athletic competition and creative storylines, and let everyone know it's not a legit fight. Did we really need to know at the time that 93,000 people were not at WrestleMania 3? Why do you think he does what he does? Why would he want to tell everyone how the magic is done if all we had as fans was the belief that it was real?
Well, at one point before, and by the way, I like to know what the real crowd sizes are, by the way, because I'm a very statistical oriented type of guy and I like facts and figures. But in the 80s, when I first became aware, and I've told this story before, but just real briefly, Jimmy Garvin had one at Crockett's Promos, late 85 in Charlotte on Wednesday morning. And he called it the scandal sheet. Nobody called them dirt sheets then, because I knew I had done fan club bulletins in the 70s, and I knew what bulletins were in fan clubs and blah, blah, blah. And I'd seen all of them. I knew Dave's name from seeing it from the California Wrestling Report in the 70s or whatever in the magazines. But we obviously never intimated that anything about wrestling wasn't on the up and up in any of those publications, usually in those days. But anyway, Jimmy called it the scandal sheet. And I said, what is this? And I read it. And of course, I fell in love with it as something that I could tell this was a pretty comprehensive and believable wrap up of what was going on in the ring in all the territories and in the office in a lot of cases, even back then in the territories. And what the fuck? This could be dangerous if it ever got out was my thing. But at the same time, I always thought that Dave was a guy who got to the business for the most part. Now, I know he likes the fucking, these guys these days and times have changed. But I respect his historical knowledge and overall his psychology of the business and his attention to detail and actually if he is wrong in something, he lets you know about it. A lot of stuff people go on and on about that he clearly writes his opinion, but nevertheless, I don't have any problem with Dave otherwise than his taste in current modern wrestling. But in those days is where I was going with this. And for quite a while, it was a really, you remember, Brian, a small subculture of, I guess Dave probably didn't have fucking 2,000 subscribers, his first year or whatever. It's grown exponentially since then. Yeah. But it was several thousand or 10,000 people maybe in those days across the country that were in close enough to the business to know about it and learn about it, and et cetera, et cetera. There was no internet. The promotions were sure not going to help you. The newspapers would do exposés, but half the time they print half bullshit anyway because they did blood capsules or whatever the fuck. I thought it was really the Observer to me for the first several years was a great in-house industry publication where you could actually everything that he said usually there was merit to, and you could kind of tell who was doing what and where and who was responsible for what and who was a pain in the ass and why were they or whatever. It just the tide turned to where it became, instead of a group that size across the country, and most of those people respected the business in their own way and were kind of, if they'd got that far, they were kind of with it, right? You remember there used to be when you got together with a group of smart fans, there was a high probability that everybody was kind of with it. Yeah. But then that started being watered down a little bit. And then the internet, and then now everybody knows. And I mean, I don't even know if there's like magician groupies or fans or the diehards, the insiders that kind of know how the tricks are done and appreciate the art, but the general population doesn't know the blueprint for the thing. And it's the way it used to be with wrestling. Now it's not, and it's the problem is you can't really get away with anything, do anything, please everybody, or everybody thinks they can somehow do whatever component of it better. So the Observer at first, And then it led the way for a bunch of people who don't get it or didn't get it, but could still publish it, to have opposing viewpoints and further muddy the issue to where now, people, there are so many ridiculous bullshit things that people have either been told about wrestling or just maybe they've got limited cognitive function and they just gleaned it that way, that it's so off kilter or whatever. But, because I know when people say, well, he once worked so-and-so or did this or did that. And no, I didn't. I don't know what the fuck they're talking about or was responsible for this. It's well known. I wonder, since I know the difference, how much the shit we hear about other people is manufactured by a lot of these people. And you could always trust Dave. It is pretty legitimate. And just like Mike Johnson.
I have to think if you were a hardcore Magic fan, you want to know how. But with wrestling, you want to know why. Why did they do this?
Well, there you go.
Yeah, that's the big difference.
That's the how and the why of it.
When you first saw The Observer, did you immediately see the influence of Weasel's World, Norm Dooley's newsletter?
Oh, well, yeah. Well, that was another thing. Actually, to call Weasel's World a newsletter is somewhat misleading. It was, and I can't even remember how often that he did them, but, it would maybe every week or two, it would have, because he'd always be at the shows in Louisville, and he'd go to St. Louis, usually once a month, and spot shows anywhere around the area, but it was basically several sheets of paper that he, on his typewriter, it was titled Weasel's World, boom. And he would type the results and the places of the shows and et cetera, et cetera. And when he was finished, he was finished. So it might be 3 pages stapled together. It might be 5. It was pages stapled together. So it wasn't really a bullet, but it was the information. And yes, Dave absorbed not only that, but Weasel's oft-times incisive wit translated over to some of Dave's early match descriptions also, or naming Junkyard Dog the junk food dog. And Weasel Dooley was also the first one to make up a completely bullshit outlaw mud show and give the results in the middle of his newsletter just to see if anybody would notice it. Because we went to Memphis for one of the Funk and Lawler matches, and on the way back, we're talking whatever the fuck, and we saw the sign for Bucksnort or whatever, right? And he's like, they should have a wrestling show there. So I get to fucking his newsletter the next week or whatever, and he has written an account of outlaw championship wrestling or something that took place in the VFW hall in Bucksnort, Tennessee on the way back from Memphis, and made up a bunch of names. And it sounds like now one of the shows they really have. He was trying to be funny and just see if anybody would notice and comment on it. But it sounds now like a show they'd have. And so won the match when the fucking ceiling fell in or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And now so he may have invented garbage wrestling too, along with the star rating system. And the Observer. Weasel Dooley is the godfather of wrestling.
Someone find him and get in touch with the show. Every time I say that, 50 people send me his phone number, but someone actually talk to him and get him in touch with the show. But let's get our next question here, Jim.
He's hiding from the world because of his notoriety.